Thank you all. Robin, I'll start with you.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to have CATL participate in the pilot here? What did you learn, and what did you learn that surprised you?
Yeah, basically, thank you for the questions. Basically, when we start a business for the EV battery or energy storage battery, we think about how to help this circulate economics, sustainability. You know, why we have a problem with climate change today, we have too many CO2 emissions. So maybe 100 years ago, when we have an internal combustion engine, we didn't think about how to do the circular. If they had already embedded the technology to circulate the internal combustion engine, to circulate the CO2 that time, then probably we have no problem. We don't need to tackling to try a lot about this EV battery power. That's why when we start a business, we think sustainability is most important. Then how can you do that? Traceability is another one. Now how to trace that? A battery passport definitely fit. So you can tell the battery story, you can start from the mining, refining, material cell, battery pack, everything. So that is number one, we align the whole philosophy with GBA. So that's why we fully support GBA to really go forward to follow this structure to make a battery definitely understandable, and we know the sustainability is there. Another way is the consumer have the right to know in the future, whatever, I think not only battery, for any product, like a car, right? You're buying a car, you're buying clothes, you're buying shoes, you should have understanding, say, what kind of impact on the environment, how this can be sustainable. That's why we can together globally making a better world in the future.
You raise a really interesting point, and obviously there's a regulatory compliance element to this, there's an investor-focused element to this, but there's also a consumer-facing element, which you just mentioned. As a supplier, consumers may be less likely to understand that it's CATL, for example, it's powering their vehicle. How do you see your role in bringing supply chain transparency to future EV buyers?
Yes, consumers say we are buying the end product from the OEM. For example, I buy a car with the OEM brand name there, but EV is a little bit different than an internal combustion engine. So people say in the future, if, for example, for consumers goods, vehicle to grid, if the vehicle to grid really connected, actually for me it's not vehicle, it's the battery to grid, right? Because battery become an energy storage for the consumer. In case we understand my battery can last in longer cycles or every cycles, then we apply my battery to the storage. When I was parking my car in the garage, the battery can work for me. For example, in the nighttime, they can charge the battery. In daytime, really discharge the battery. Then every cycle, probably we can gain some profit from there. That's why battery become very important in the car. It's not because in the EV especially, it's not only power the car for transportation, it also can be the energy storage to help the grid, to help your home, to help whatever, even in the, any extreme case, disaster case, you have battery to back up your electricity in your home to support. All this is energy source can help the consumer. That's why I think consumers should have the right to know how good is my battery, how far away my battery can go, and how many money I can get from the battery.
Thank you. Benedikt, let me turn to you. You were one of the founding members of the Alliance back in 2017 under the World Economic Forum. From the mining side of the supply chain, which you know deeply, how do you see the benefits of this initiative? And as Graham mentioned in his presentation, it's the mining and refining data. In some cases, it's the hardest to get at.
Well, in 2016, when we had these initial discussions about building out a supply chain that is going to be one of the largest supply chains in the world, It all started around a little coffee table at the World Economic Forum, and I was one of the representatives of the metals and mining industry. And we had done internal numbers that this is going to be, I like to use that term, the biggest purchase order in history, at least for the mining industry. And we then thought, well, how does it actually translate downstream? What are the implications for the next person in the supply chain? How is he going to make sure that whatever materials he procures are produced sustainably, are produced without using child labor? At that point, we tried to simplify it to just a couple of factors. Now we're looking at a number of factors. And the complexity was very different because there were not many electric vehicles sold. Battery, grid storage, ESS was virtually inexistent. It turned out to be an incredible journey because the global battery line started with 5 members, right? So actually what you see on this panel here, and it's really grown into this spectacular global multi-stakeholder organization. And multi-stakeholder is an important element because it's not an industry organization, right? And there's plenty of industry organizations, but this is different because it tries to bring together different players in the industry, different players outside of the industry, host governments and so on. So it's really an exciting journey, and what we're seeing is these supply chains, as they grow, become more complex. In 2016, there were probably only 2 countries really producing lithium. Right? Today we're probably at 20. Similar in cobalt, there was just literally 1 producing country. Now we're at 3 or 4. And downstream as well, the battery chemistry becomes more complex. The type of customers become more complex. And the ESS segment is growing very rapidly. I think it's today something 20–80%, roughly like that. Our estimate would be that we'll be on 50% very soon. So there are more use cases, there are more customers, the supply chain becomes more complex, so transparency is going to be very, very important, but also much more difficult to do, and that's why we have technology. And the battery passport, when the initial passport was launched, was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, with the little barcode, that was just a concept, and to see it today, actually in real life is so fascinating. So it's great to see how this little baby over the last 7–8 years has grown into what it is today. So thanks for everyone who contributed.
You've also made the case that the mining industry needs more investment to produce the materials required to hit Paris Agreement targets, to do that sustainably, and to supply what EV demand will need in the future. Does this initiative help? How does this initiative help in that side of things?
When maybe 10 years ago, people talked about the mining industry as a key supplier to the energy transition, nobody listened, right? We were kind of the dark side of the moon people that were more part of the problem than part of the solution. When you now go and speak to policymakers and also customers, they do understand the importance, and they also do understand all the importance of diversification in the supply chain. To be dependent just on one single supplying country is risky, so you need to diversify your supply. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually translate into a lot of additional investment. And you see today in the valuations of most of the mining companies, the average S&P forecast is, I think it's 20. The average mining company multiple of earnings forward is 5, right? So there's an 80% discount against the market for an industry which is so crucial for building out the energy transition, because there's no energy transition without materials. And it's not just the materials that we see here, the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel, which have often not many other uses other than in batteries. But for me, the biggest worry is in copper, right? Because copper is by far the most used material in the energy transition, whether it's in the vehicles and the grid storage, it's the charging infrastructure, it's the distribution lines, it's the power generations, the backup power generations. So you need copper anywhere and everywhere. And it's technologically agnostic, because for Robin, it doesn't matter whether he has an LFP or an NMC cathode, but he will need a lot of copper, right? And there's no way to avoid that. And it's very difficult to scale copper projects, and there's an estimate, I think, by BHP, which is the largest copper producer, that we will be 5 million tons of copper short, which is about 25% shortage by 2030. And that's very worrying, because it's very difficult to ramp up copper production, and we need more investment in that space. So.
Thank you. Inga, I'm going to take you up on your offer to ask you the hard questions too. Just before we pivot too far from Graham's presentation, in this pilot you added new criteria, and I think, as he described it, saw where the gaps are in the data. I just wonder if you could talk about kind of what you took away from that part of the pilot experience.
Okay, maybe I need to just take one step back because, you know, in terms of the role that the GBA plays here, so we've heard how complex the value chains are. We saw that we cut, just in the simple piloting exercise, we cut across 5 continents. So if you visualize the journey of these materials from the mine all the way into the battery, it's almost innumerable how many lives and environments this material touches. So the space that we've created for the first time actually allows to say what are the risks and impacts of this value chain, and what does good sustainability performance actually mean for different constituents. So Benedikt highlighted we're not an industry association. Indeed, we've created this unique platform where we can bring together the industry, and not just the mining sector, not just the cell makers, but the end-to-end value chain with NGOs, civil society organizations, academia, public sector, international development organizations, to start, these are the salient issues, and now we're going to define together what does good sustainability performance mean. What can companies feasibly be expected to do to identify risks and address them, and where does civil society and other stakeholders, local communities, ideally want them to be, so that we can chart this trajectory of continuous improvement and also measure progress over time. So I think I just want to say that as a precursor, you know, in terms of the context and the rationale for these rule books, because these due diligence requirements are usually defined by the downstream, by the buyers. They want to have their good conscience that they're buying a product that's been, you know, sustainably produced. But at the same time, it's a really complex ecosystem, and the upstream is also used to responsible sourcing standards. But for the midstream, it's maybe a bit newer. So this exercise has helped us to build already, I think, capacity across the value chain to even face these expectations, to extend them to your own suppliers, and then to package all of that into something that is understandable and comparable and measurable. So this is obviously a huge learning, and I think the data gaps show that. You know, how can we progressively go through the chain? Where are the biggest gaps? We've had a big question around, are these issues actually applicable in my jurisdiction? So one of the key takeaways that we're thinking, how do we add a risk filter and a saliency filter for operations, so that you can really pinpoint, you know, you need to hone in on this issue in this jurisdiction, for example, because it also has to stay a manageable effort.
You touched on this, so I wanted to follow up. I mean, the GBA is the largest organization of its kind. And, you know, we saw the participants, it's everyone in this room and well beyond. What can you do to ensure that you're getting participation that the mission needs from other stakeholders, NGOs and unions, and importantly, you know, voices from people in the communities that are affected at the far end of the supply chain?
Yeah, of course you cannot engage with local community organizations on all 5 continents. So of course we need to work with umbrella organizations, with expert organizations, with international organizations who have a good standing, or good understanding. It's also important to highlight that we're not reinventing the wheel. When it comes to best practices, whether that's biodiversity or respect for indigenous people's rights or child labor due diligence, there's very good standards that are already out there. But so far, they are applicable only at specific parts of the value chain, and they're not mainstreamed across the supply chain to apply at the product level. So in a way, the battery passport is a translation matrix to mainstream these requirements across the value chain where the risks are salient, and then apply it at the product level so that it becomes an actionable insight for consumers. And I also always like to highlight, you know, what is the alternative? So we now have a battery passport requirement in the EU. We already have certification schemes across the various sectors. In the absence of a globally harmonized framework, we will have various instruments making various claims about the sustainability performance according to various standards that will become almost incomprehensible for a regular purchaser. So we're trying to provide that umbrella to say this is actually globally applicable. We are borrowing from these best practice standards that are already well in operations, that have certification schemes and auditing schemes, but we're validating this at the product level and making it actually comparable.
And Diep, let me turn to you. How will you as an investor, you know, from that perspective, how would this data, how would the passport be used? How is it useful to you?
Well, at the IFC and wider World Bank Group, when we invest, we look at our environmental, social, and governance standards. And at the IFC, we also have our performance standards. And the performance standards look at many of the things that are already being covered by GBA's passport. So, for example, environment, biodiversity, labor standards, indigenous people's rights. And again, many of the GBA standards here are, that I think the team looked at IFC performance standards. So we do our own due diligence regardless. Before we invest, we do our own due diligence. We make sure that the project and the company, the project aligns with our performance standards and ESG standards. Now, to the extent that the project or the company has certification from a credible source, then it provides us a good piece of information. Maybe it's good enough, maybe not, but it all depends on the value of the certification system. And what is a good certification system? The data, the verifiability of the data, the value of the data is very important. The disclosure of the data is very important. If not disclosed to everyone, then certainly disclosed to the investor. And the impartiality of the data is important. Having a third-party verifier and a third-party auditor, the ability of an auditor to look over that system or that data and to be able to verify that data if needed is also important. So having a verification system definitely helps. A credible certification system that's recognized by governments, by different groups of stakeholders, including NGOs, international groups. All of that adds to a certification system's credibility. But again, before we invest, we have our own framework for due diligence.
There are other industries, other sectors that have parallel initiatives. I know you know, with your background, you know a lot about and have worked deeply with the EDGE certification for green buildings. What are the takeaways that have worked in other sectors that you think are applicable here?
Definitely. So EDGE Green Building Certification System is, just to explain to everyone what it is, the construction and building sector accounts for about 40% of global GHG emissions. So it's a huge sector that contributes a huge amount of emissions. And so the IFC decided to tackle this sector to minimize, to lower emissions. And when we looked in 2015, we saw that the existing certification schemes are rather complex, very expensive, and certainly too expensive for many emerging markets where we work. We only invest in emerging markets and developing economies. So we decided to go and develop our own certification system, digitized, made available to the public as a public good. And anyone of you can go now to edgebuildings.com and you'll actually see that it's a very simple certification system. So we designed a digital system accessible to everyone based on 3 simple but very powerful climate indicators. One is energy efficiency, the second is water efficiency, and the third is the carbon captured in building materials. With just those 3 indicators alone, the calculator can figure out whether your building design is efficient compared to buildings in your locality. So you're not comparing a building in China to a building in New York or in Zambia. You're comparing a building to the locality. And so it's a very powerful tool. It's affordable and easy to use. And the lessons from that system, so since 2015, we have now certified already 33 million square meters of assets. which has facilitated $33 billion of investments in assets. And the IFC ourselves have invested $16 billion in these assets. So we invest about $2 to $4 billion a year so far in these green assets. And the lessons emerging out of that is, again, also what I mentioned, the verifiability of the data, the credibility of the data is important. We also certify, we have a system to certify the experts that are doing the verification. We also have third-party auditors, and the data is disclosed. And maybe the final and most important part, maybe two more important factors. We tie the green building certification to a financial incentive, to green financing. So EDGE Green Building Certification is a recognized use of proceeds in the International Green Financing Framework. So if you get EDGE Green Building Certification, you can go to a bank and get a green loan or a green mortgage. Developers or banks can issue a green bond for EDGE certified buildings. So there's a financial incentive to certification. And we could not have done it without donor support. We had the UK government was the first to support, and now many more governments support, but the advisory and technical assistance funds provided to allow us to convene, to design the system, to provide capacity to development support for the various groups of stakeholders. That was very important. But they also provided blended finance support, that is grants to lower the cost of green building.
You've mentioned financial incentives, and Robin, on that point, if I could turn back to you, what's the business case for this initiative? I think you mentioned one element of this, which is helps the consumer understand what the battery is. Are there other considerations? Does it help promote battery recycling? How do you think about the business case here?
I think for business case, actually, first time is you have to buy and sell, right? Buy the battery is we compare usually the cost of the battery or cost of the car, EVs. But we want them to not only compare the initial cost, we need to really consider the total cost of ownership. So when a consumer have consider buying a car, it's not buying a consumer product, or buying a battery is not buying a consuming product. It's like an investor. Because you buy the battery, if the battery have a longer cycle life and a calendar life, the battery, through battery to grid, then can provide you more profit or reduce the initial cost. So this comparison will help consumer to judge. That will bring a lot of benefit from the high quality, long cycle life, circulate the sustainability of the battery to help them in the finance side. Actually, when Ben talked about the mining, actually in the mining side, there's now a lot of issue in the mining because they don't have a lot of electricity, right? But today we can build the zero carbon industry zone for the mining industry. For example, now we are working with some African mine. We're going to put the solar cell there, we put the wind turbine, and we put we call grid form energy storage technology. We just present probably this time, this afternoon. So we're making a whole, I think we call microgrid, or small grid area, which really can support almost 365 days, almost 45 days. Maybe 1 year, only 20 days. We have really extremely no wind, no sun, all these kind of things. Then you may don't have enough electricity. So if you can have well-planned the weather projections, you can make it a whole mining green, okay? And the low cost. That's so important. That's why mining, refining is difficult, but if we have this kind of called zero carbon technology with the grid form the energy storage technology together, we will very quickly demo a big project for you guys, for GBA people to visit in Africa. Yeah, because today electricity is so huge, right? It's very expensive. Now using our technology, it can be as as cheap or as low cost as China's electricity fee. Is we can bring the both the good technology, clean technology, and low cost. On the other hand, I really want to urge the World Bank give us some also incentive about this green bond or whatever. Then we want together probably can bring another level of the sustainability growth for GBA's project.
Really interesting. When you invite the GBA to visit the microgrid, bring some reporters too.
Yeah, more than welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Ben, you've been involved, you said, from the coffee table light bulb moment. What's the next step? Is there a step beyond the sustainability certification for this program? Where does it go in the long run?
Well, originally the idea was to drive sustainability in this expanding supply chain by giving consumers a choice. That's why we very early wanted to have a visible badge on the back of the vehicle that's similar to this barcode here, that allows the ultimate consumer to compare products and take a conscientious decision whether you would like to take this product, that product, based on transparent scores. And here we're just at the beginning, right? I would imagine that consumer choice is ultimately what is going to drive the right behavior and not regulation. Right? Regulation is great, but we want consumers to decide whether they want to reduce carbon emissions or not. And you see that today with the absence of a global carbon tax or with the absence of a globally uniform system. It is only going to be customers that will decide whether CO2 emissions will be reduced in the transportation sector or in the power sector. And the impact can be massive. So if you have, initially when we kicked off the global battery lines, we estimated that batteries can reduce around 30% of the carbon emissions in the transportation sector and up to 25% in the infrastructure and power generation sector. The potential is much bigger than this. We've already reached that 30% potential in the transportation sector, for example, in China, not in the US, because the US has a much lower penetration rates of vehicles. And the impact is tangible. Kevin, you mentioned at the beginning that the existing fleet of electric vehicles this year will replace, this year's about 2 million barrels of oil. By the end of the decade, it will be 5 million barrels of oil. And people who don't know the oil market well, 5 million barrels of oil is 4 times the production of Norway, right, which is the largest oil producer in Europe. And 15 million barrels of oil, which is the forecast for 2050, is the entire production of the United States of America, which is today the largest oil producer in the world. So the impact is massive. And if you look at CATL, who is the world's largest battery producer, this town here is the biggest man-made carbon sink because it replaces 40% of the world's CO2 emissions in electric vehicles. So the impact is massive, and I think this is where the GBA has such a wonderful catalytic impact, accelerating impact on reducing carbon emissions, because it will allow consumers to take the right decisions, and the right decisions will ultimately also be the cost-effective and most competitive, because only then customers take a different choice if it's good for their pocket. And what Robin mentioned earlier, the battery to grid, that's the next big thing. Battery to grid will allow people to make money by having a battery that feeds power back into the grid when the price is high and pulls power back in when the price is low. And that is going to be a major impact of connecting the transportation emission reduction potential with the power generation emission reduction potential that we calculated initially when we kicked off the global battery line. So that's the next level.
Inga, since the EU battery regulations were introduced, there are a number of initiatives that have launched around supply chain transparency. How do you see the contribution of the GBA in that landscape?
So I think one element I spoke to in terms of developing these globally harmonized sustainability performance expectations that all stakeholder groups can contribute to. So it's not just a view from the downstream or from the buyers, but it's really a view that cuts across the supply chain. What do we actually expect the participants in this value chain to deliver in terms of sustainability impacts and performance? But then the space that we created is also just a fantastic sandbox because these requirements are coming either way. And we're offering an opportunity for companies to pre-competitively work across the normal areas of interest, I imagine, to see how do we actually make this work in a way that it benefits both us, because Robin spoke of the business case, but there's a very clear business case for this transparency, of course, because even if you just look at carbon emissions, if through a battery passport and carbon tracking or emissions tracking, you identify hotspots, that usually also equates to energy inefficiencies. So, this actually allows you a full picture and a different way to address it. So there's a clear business case for this transparency and for addressing it. But we've created this sandbox environment where companies can work together pre-competitively to see how do we tailor this product to meet these different objectives, from investors to securing green finance, green investments, to end consumers, and also to B2B procurement. So one of the big constituencies that we didn't talk about, but that we had a conversation about at our AGM in Shanghai, the 2 days preceding this Ningde trip, was public procurement, for example. Because if we're looking, not just at small passenger vehicle, but electric bus fleets in cities around the world, they're spending public money. So right now, they're all developing their own criteria and ESG criteria on how they should be procuring according to their municipal jurisdictions and others. So for them, it's also a huge asset to engage in this process and to harmonize it and roll it out.
And Diep, finally, you mentioned that data is important. You want to stress test any data that you're looking at the IFC, the World Bank. The participation here, 80%, or more than 80% of global battery manufacturers represented in pilots, quite a large share. But what other partnerships, what other collaborations would increase the reach and improve the sort of effectiveness of this metric as we move towards a potentially global standard?
Well, first of all, let me congratulate Inga and the GBA team for having already achieved 170 partnerships. That's a tremendous number. And covering 5 continents, covering all kinds of stakeholder groups. So, I think you've already covered the major stakeholder groups. First, you have certainly the OEMs, the manufacturers. I would say to try to balance that out, look for continents that are not as well represented as others, maybe more from North America. I think I've seen companies from Japan and Korea there, but even more. So more balanced representation, more voices from the Global South. Certainly I see companies from the Global South, I see companies from Latin America represented, but also from the government side. Government of Zambia is there, congratulations, that's great. I used to live in Zambia for 3 years, so I was very happy to see the government of Zambia here. Government of Canada, Germany. So you already have governments from 3 continents, but more governments joining would add more credibility. I see that you have some major international organizations as members. EBRD is there. The United Nations organizations, UNICEF, and especially United Nations Environment Program, they convene all the governments on environmental and climate issues. So that's a major convener. And so leveraging the UN organizations to help reach, for the outreach to bring in more government members, bilateral government members is very useful. I'm glad to see the academia and research institutions as members of the GBA, RMI, WRI. So you have some very credible organizations. Here's my alma mater, the Kennedy School at Harvard is there. That's excellent. And some NGOs. I'm very happy that it's great that you have included NGOs, and specifically NGOs that focus on responsible mining, on ESG criteria, that outreach to communities. So I think you've covered all the bases. I think at this point it's really about breadth and depth, continuing on that trend.
And I think with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for a really interesting discussion. Thank you. I'll hand back to Inga for some final words and choreography.
Yeah, I want to add my thanks. I think first of all to all the pilot participants for achieving this significant milestone. This is truly pioneering work, and we've stepped up the game significantly since last time. We had many repeat customers. CATL was one of the companies that went into the proof of concept, and they put their faith in us again. So Robin, thank you so much for putting your best people on the job and leading by example. It's really been tremendous to see this engagement, and you of course have such an important influence on all the others to pull along. So this is where pre-competitiveness works also well, because we want to encourage the best practices and that race to the top, and we're already sort of seeing that emerge even in this early days. So thank you so much. And thanks to Benedikt, we've had this founding member role mentioned here. So Benedikt has really been incubating this organization from that coffee table to where we are today, and I really don't think we would be where we are now without his support and advocacy. And also, of course, to Diep and the IFC. We have so much to learn from you when it comes to certification and how investors think about these issues in green finance. So thank you all so much, and the team, first of all, and or last but not least, the team who has really worked around the clock to bring all of this together. So we're really, really grateful. We're only just getting started, and really look forward to taking this to the next stage. In terms of logistics, we have been asked to stay in your seats, and for the speakers to take their seat one more time for a family photograph. And then after that, you'll be released.